We can go even if I don't.
This is perfect. And we are live in 3, 2, 1. Beautiful. There we both are. You in the glorious HD on the right-hand side, and me in the camera loading box. This is perfect. Let me just find a way to put my camera up. Ross, you're live to everyone. Say hi.
Hello.
For anyone who is not familiar with your work, just let people know a bit of your background, who you are, and what you are doing with the Stop Killing Games initiative.
Sure. I'm a YouTuber who sort of stumbled into that, and I mostly just make kind of game-related various comedy videos. And the Stop Killing Games thing is a movement I put together to basically stop the practice of publishers destroying video games that's been increasing over the years and just got under my skin. You know?
Getting under your skin is a perfect way to put this, because I think what you're doing is a tad more extreme than you're letting people know. I'm just changing the chat text to black so people can actually read and see what's going on. There we go. Beautiful. You guys can now read what's going on. So, Ross, let's just go back and start with your kind of beginnings of YouTube so people get a more kind of well-rounded idea of how much you love video games. When did you start YouTube?
Geez, I guess 2007, around there. Something like that. I was actually making a few videos before YouTube. Like, it existed, but like this, it wasn't at a point where it was considered like a great place to put videos, or there'd be like a couple minutes limit on it.
So you're using it more of an archive of your work instead of a kind of full-time job thing?
Not even that. Like, some of them, the earlier ones I had to split up because they were too... I had one that was over 10 minutes and like, uh-oh, can't have that on YouTube. So, no, I guess the first... Well, I mean, I messed around with internal stuff, but the first public thing I did was Civil Protection, which was... I used the Source engine for Half-Life 2 to 3D animate characters and did little shorts in that. However, that was very time consuming. So as an experiment, I made Freeman's Mind, where I tried to give like a free-flowing thought process to Gordon Freeman from Half-Life, since he's one of the more famous silent video game protagonists. So I tried to make him as interesting as possible, and that probably became the most popular thing I'll ever do, just by accident. And I need to continue on, but...
When you say the most popular thing you ever do by accident, that was exactly how I stumbled into the Worst MMO Ever series. I just saw a game being advertised that looked terrible, that I decided I'm going to make a video on this and see what happens. Turns out that it was the most successful video, because people love watching old video games. They love watching bad video games. I think a lot of people want to experience video games without necessarily needing to play them. They just want to know what the story's like, where the mechanics go to.
Oh, I do the same if I don't like the gameplay. I love it when people put up playthroughs of these long games. I'm thinking, oh man, this is so grindy, but I'm really curious about the story and everything, you know?
Yeah, spot on. Exactly the same thing. When people say to me, I mean, one of my favorite YouTubers right now is a guy called Grand Pooh Bear, who plays the old SNES and NES games through to completion. Like, he'll beat the old, I think he beat Zombies Ate My Neighbors all the way through. Then he beat the Jurassic Park games, all the classic. We have, as gamers, this kind of morbid curiosity with old games and bad games. And I think it's great that we're able to go back and play the old games and the bad games. So tell us a bit about your Game Dungeon series.
Yeah, Game Dungeon is another kind of experiment I did that turned out successful.
With something like
where it's a sort of review show, but I just try to... It's not even that formal. I just sometimes pick a game I want to talk about, and sometimes it leans more on the sort of review side or kind of playthrough side. Other times it's just almost like a platform for free-form thought, that this game just provoked lots of thoughts I was having. I thought, you know what, I'll just talk about this and try to keep it interesting for people, you know. So it can kind of... I'm still trying to figure out what it is, but that's a...
I think
I try to find some reason for people to want to watch it, I guess, is...
I think the Game Dungeon, without a doubt, is one of the most interesting YouTube series I've I'm very happy that I've watched all the videos that you've put out, because I'm never going to play those games. And even if I wanted to, I don't think I'd be able to get them working on modern systems. So talk about some of the issues that you've had getting old PC games specifically to run on modern hardware.
Yeah, it's almost like the sort of thing you can make a giant flow chart out of, where, you know, it's like, okay, well, first let's just try running it natively and see what happens. Okay, then if we get some bugs, I guess look up, see if there's any community patches for it. It might be so unknown, like nobody even remembers this game exists. In that case, I usually try to, well, it varied. I used to use more what's called a virtual machine, where you essentially install a copy of Windows or DOS even inside it to get it working. But that's one option. But actually, I found that as I upgraded my CPU, older versions of that stopped working or would be extremely buggy. But then around that time, I got lucky, and that emulation has gotten better and better. For old Windows games, there's one called PCEM, which is, again, you still have to install you can emulate different hardware at the time, and that can get things working. For DOS games, DOSBox usually covers it. At one point, I had a game that didn't work on DOSBox. I had to install a DOS environment for it. I think it became redundant, but I think for one game I played a while back, I even had to install a floppy drive emulator because I didn't have one at the time, and that was the only way it could save the game inside of it. It's almost like, you know, you're bringing a box of tools and just messing with it until you find one that works. And even then, it might not work all the way, because Game Dungeon, Armed and Delirious, I made it a ways playing it on Windows 98, and then I ran into show-stopping bugs, whereas I cannot proceed further in this game. And I had to go and, you know, have a virtual environment for Windows 95, and only under that would it can continue to work. So
the amount of effort and time that you go to make these old games work, just for our entertainment, is phenomenal. And I'm guessing that you don't get too much help from the companies that originally made the game. You're getting much more help from the communities that played the game, or the communities that pop up around the game nowadays. How much of your series exists because of community input and community help?
Well, that's a tricky question. No, you say help from the companies themselves. I'm not sure I've ever had that. I mean, most of the time I go in assuming I'm on my own. It's only few more recent episodes where I got help that it wasn't necessarily to run the game, but it's to make it better, like to get rid of like this noise grain filter that I hated, film noise filter, or make it widescreen where it was never intended for that, but it seemed possible. No, for earlier ones, okay, your question is how much is from the community? It's hard to say. I'd say anywhere from like 20 to 40%, something around that. See, the thing to understand is all these old games of Game Dungeon, I was kind of doing this anyway before I even made Game Dungeon, because I remember seeing that game a long while back, and nobody's talked about it at all. I'm curious what happened in that. I want to see if I can go through and beat it. And so I would kind of do this on my own anyway. So Game Dungeon makes it just a more kind of established process where I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm not just going to play it. I have to think of like a script, or what am I going to say about this, and arrange it so that hopefully it's watchable, that sort of thing.
And then you started to, Game Dungeon became very successful. You had a lot of repeat viewers. It became a bit of a cult thing to go and watch. And one of your most successful videos, or a game that people connect with you now, is the video game The Crew. Just tell everyone a little bit about your background with The Crew, what The Crew is, and why you like it so much.
Yeah, that one, it's kind of a coincidence that led to a lot more. But what I liked about the game was it's the second largest driving game ever made. And in my opinion, it's the best representation I've ever seen from like a ground level view of the continental United States. So, you know, you go to the south, you see like the vegetation change, and keep going farther, there's like some swampland. You know, in the north, you go to the west, you have the Rocky Mountains. You know, on California, you have vineyards, that sort of thing. So it's like a miniaturized version of the United States, but even then it's still enormous. And I don't know, it just kind of scratches an itch I like about it. Like, just as a racing game, I think it's just kind of so-so. It's like, okay, it's all right. It actually has a plot line, which many racing games don't. And it's just sort of okay, but just the world itself that they created, I haven't come across anything like it.
I think you and me have a similar love for video game maps as well. I love seeing I remember many years ago I was playing a PlayStation 2 snowboarding game called SSX Tricky, and part of the kind of DVD bonus extras where you could see the developers flying around the levels in 3D. You could see the wireframe design of the level, which showed you where all the secrets were, all the hidden tunnels, all the little tricks, all the little jumps, and I loved seeing that because it's giving you almost like a god view of this digital world that you've been existing in for so long, and designing the map and designing the level to lead the player through in a certain experience that's an art and a skill unto itself. You've got access to a couple of digital video game maps, haven't you? What started the interest in game world maps?
I think it's just kind of wanting to see the full picture that you might not even see playing through the entire game. Sometimes where the game might be kind of zoomed in and then you just go through it. But then sometimes these will be like hard pixel maps. It's like, well, you can actually piece them all together if you wanted, and then just get kind of a bird's eye view. I guess I would compare it to be like the first people who maybe had flight, like in a balloon or something, finally being able to like look down at their town that they maybe known their whole lives. And then just like, it's just kind of neat being able to see it in a completely different way, I think, is what my main appeal of that is. But sometimes you run into some secrets that can be juicier than others, or just see odd things. Like when you were mentioning the secrets, I was remembering in Silent Hill 2, where you go down this staircase, and in the game, it's just you're going on and on and on. But like some people have actually mapped it out. It's just like this ridiculously long staircase. Seeing it in map form is just kind of a neat feeling.
There's a very similar part in the video game Dark Souls 1. If anyone in the chat has played Dark Souls, there is what looks like to be an endless corridor that you have to run down while fighting one of the bosses. And people thought that it was just a small section of corridor looping. But when they saw the 3D map, turns out it's just a really long corridor that they built. They couldn't be bothered to do a looping thing, so they just put in a massively long corridor that does the same thing. But allowing us to see the digital map, the 3D game world of that, was phenomenal. So I've linked back to your love for the crew. I've linked back to your love for digital worlds. We've talked about the fact that you've got most of your help from the community, and it's old games that you're getting running on modern hardware. You are now not only known for Freeman's Mine, not only known for the Game Dungeon, but you're also connected to this Stop Killing Games initiative. What is that?
Yeah. Again, that's a movement where we talk about all these old games. What's bothered me just for the longest time is games that basically get effectively destroyed, where they're not just hard to run, where if you throw enough time and resources at, you can get it running again. These are ones that just, it's impossible because they almost all depended on a central server that the publisher was in control of. Then they shut it down and then left the players with nothing. And typically the only way you get games like that back is for people kind of reverse engineering a server emulator, which I can't even fathom how much work that is. And there's probably only just clusters of people on the planet who are even capable of doing something like that, even if you did have the time and knowledge. But so it's kind of mounted in, see, at first this mostly hit MMOs, which I didn't play as much of, especially in the early days, because, they charge by the month, which was out of my kind of budgeting. But then it kind of drifted over into other games. Like, I think the first game I played that I wanted to play this game was Battle Forge, and that was like a real-time strategy game with, cards related to it, kind of a fantasy thing, the sort of thing I might be interested in playing. And then that got shut down. Then another game that I was interested in was a Darkspore, which was, again, it was so-so, but it was interesting. Kind of a action RPG with aliens and alien worlds. And, again, that's the sort of thing I'm interested in, those kinds of themes. And then now it's just spreading more and more. And The Crew is an example of that, where, see, The Crew, I believe the developers for it, they came from other big open world driving games like Test Drive Unlimited 1 and 2, where, they model one of the entire islands of Hawaii so that you can just drive all around in. And you can still play those games now, because even though they had an online mode, the single player could still work offline. And The Crew is just many times larger than that. So it really bugged me that this was designed this way, that it was going to have a lifespan on it where no one could ever play it again. And again, this part, okay, now I strayed off the topic, but okay, so Stop Killing Games emerged from this, where I've been kind of looking for an opportunity to try and challenge this practice. And I just never really found a good one. And by coincidence, The Crew ended up being the perfect candidate for this. I would have acted on this for any game. Like, I was considering this all for Overwatch, which I've never even played, but I just hate this practice, and I want it to be challenged legally. Because the thing is, this idea that you're sold a copy of a game, then you're given no time frame for how long it's going to last as a customer. Then it's shut down, and you're given no recourse. That has actually, the legality of that has actually not been tested in multiple countries. It's just sort of, now in the US, it's been established for a long time, even though it wasn't really common knowledge. But in other countries, I think they just, politicians or lawmakers don't really pay that much attention to video games unless it's something where it involves like gambling or children being exposed to inappropriate things, that sort of thing. So this kind of just flew under the radar. I compared it to like Uber coming on the scene, where they weren't sure, governments weren't sure if these were taxi services or are these employees or contractors. The laws just weren't written for that situation. So when The Crew announced it was going to shut down, I looked for every angle I could possibly find. And I reached out to my viewers for help on this also, to see like, okay, can we report this to consumer protection agencies, was the first line of thinking. And it turns out, like, yes, we were able to. And since we put so much work into the research, I also found out about government petitions where you can bring this before various governments directly. And the biggest one we found was the European Citizens Initiative, which, if it passes, enough people sign on to this saying like, hey, we have a problem. We wish the government to take a look at this and hopefully, pass law on it. They're required to look at this by a regulatory committee and give an answer on it. And if they think it's a problem, they can form new law on this. The problem is getting that threshold. So Stop Killing Games has been all of this together. And right now, all the Consumer Protection Agency stuff is underway, and whatever happens, happens. We can't influence that one way or the other, but they are taking this issue seriously. It's been escalated in France, Germany, and Australia, which have relatively robust consumer protection laws, to see if this practice is legal. That's what The Crew is used for. Now, this Citizens Initiative, that's what we're still working on and trying to get signatures for. Yeah, for anybody who quits, go to stopkillinggames.com if you're in the EU and wish to help with this. All you have to do is basically sign it, give your personal information to the EU. They're protecting it. We're not managing any of that. And if we get enough signatures by the end of July, then we might honestly be able to change the law on this. And I can go on, but I don't want to.
No, please do, because people are excited about this. I've already signed this now because the UK decided to do that weird thing where we left the EU. If you're based in the UK, you can still sign part of the petition. Go to stopkillinggames.com. It is a globally interesting thing now. We've got so many people from so many countries. But what companies and lawyers are kind of pushing back on, I think, correct me if I'm wrong on this, is some people have said to you, do you want to own video games once the companies that make them effectively stop supporting them? Are you looking for the trademark? Are you looking for the copyright? Are you looking for all of the legal ownership to be able to sell them on? Or do you just want them to be playable?
From a legal standpoint, we are not seeking ownership of the game because, or full ownership, because that entails many other things. Even without we definitely aren't seeking the intellectual property rights, like you mentioned. But even without that, ownership implies like you can resell it, and we're kind of personally, I'm actually mildly against that for digital only games for a few reasons. I think it actually works out better for customers and the companies to like not have resale value, but that's something that would come with full ownership. But no, like you said, what we're looking for and what's in the initiative is saying that they're going to leave the video once they end support for a game. The publisher will be required to leave it in a playable state without requiring connections to the publisher or affiliated third parties. So you might need to log into the server the entire time they're supporting the game. We're not seeking to interfere with that. But at the end of that, they have to give something to the customers who have paid for this. Now, it gets more complicated than that, but that's the simple version.
That phrase, leave it in a playable state. Now, there's an example that I want to bring up specifically. I was talking about it earlier before we started this interview to anyone who was on the Twitch stream. I believe it's Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, anyone in the Twitch chat. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 was a physically printed disc game that you would put into either an Xbox or a PlayStation. And on the disc was the data for one level of the game. That was it. What the disc then did was allow you to connect to the server that hosted the rest of the game and download the rest of the game. So if you bought that game when the server was online, you would be able to play Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. However, if you go and buy that disc now and put it into a games console, because the servers that downloaded the rest of the game are offline, you only get one level. The data that's on the disc. You get nothing else. If you didn't download the data back when the servers were available, you can now no longer play that game. You can no longer get access to it. That is what I would call a feels bad moment if you went out to a shop and bought that disc. Even if you bought it secondhand. If you came home one day, you were excited to play Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, you put it in your games console, and then you were told, nope, this game is no longer accessible. How many games do you believe have either gone through a similar situation, or how many do you think are going to go through a similar situation if the law continues as it is?
That situation, I don't know. It could be a lot. You see, I tend to be more of, in my buying habits, I tend to be more of a bottom feeder where I'm buying stuff when it's on sale years after the fact. So you probably get better answers from someone who's buying brand new ones, stick it in, so they know firsthand for a lot of games. I can say, see, that's actually an example where it would be, that particular example would be a bit of a gray area, but probably not too much, because the game is semi-playable, but let's say in their advertising, they said like, okay, it comes with 15 maps or something like that. Well, once it says that, then we're getting pretty clearly into the realm of this is not a reasonable compensation for what the game was advertised as. You know, whereas say they got 14 of the maps out of 15, and then one they didn't patch that, well, then that'll be harder. See, it's kind of a spectrum where on one side, if the game is almost all there, but maybe it's missing something like matchmaking or achievements or something like that, there's probably not going to be that many complaints about it, and people are going to be glad that it's mostly still intact. Whereas if it's something like what you mentioned, we're like, okay, we get this one small level, the rest of the game is just unplayable. Well, that would be a case where if this was passed, people could file complaints with the Consumer Protection Agency in their country, the EU, and then the more egregious the state of the game is, the more likely there'll be complaints, and then they would open a case on this and say like, yeah, you advertised 15 levels, only one of them's playable, that you didn't exercise due diligence in having an end of life plan for your game. And the other thing I was going to add quick was for games, actually I plan to have a video on this in the near future. We've actually did some research for games that are just completely unplayable. Like the number I think we found is at least 200 to 300 where they just shut it down, then you can't play it in any form whatsoever.
We've got a couple of people in the chat right now who are making some really good points. One point I want to bring up here is the thing that I have against this whole thing. This is a comment that I'm reading. Ignoring MMOs and such is that the phrase playable state would require a company to have effectively a playable state of every update, every iteration, every patch of a game. The example they use is, I believe, Final Fantasy XIV version 1. Because you mentioned this is a grey area, this is more of a spectrum. It's not so much every single state of every video game ever made will be playable at every patch level and every single kind of update point it was ever at, but more video games will be left in an acceptable state that they are playable. Some of them might require a bit more effort to be put into. You know, you might need to download maybe an emulator, you might need to download a couple of patches, you might do a little bit of work with the actual data. But I think ultimately what we're trying to get to is video games are art. Someone has designed a beautiful level, someone has made a beautiful soundtrack, someone has created an incredible combat system, someone has woven a beautiful narrative through this. And for them to just be thrown away after a company has finished making money with it, that feels bad.
Yeah, that's 100% of my personal drive behind all this. Almost everything we've actually been doing has been focused on consumer protections and consumer rights, because those laws have much more teeth, where there's barely anything on preservation of art or cultural works, creative works, anything like that. But that's where all my personal motivation for this comes from. Because yeah, I'm of the attitude of that a good game is a good game. You know, if it came out 20 years ago, like you said, hey, maybe the music's better than anything I've heard this year, you know, or hey, this was really a fascinating world, or, you know, interesting gameplay, that sort of thing.
So one of my most successful YouTube series is about an MMORPG called Otherland. I don't know if anyone in the chat has seen this before. I made a series called I Played the Worst MMO on Steam through to the end. Otherland was this visual trip, this digital graveyard of absolutely incredible, wild, fantastical stories based on the Tad William novel Otherland. And a lot of people watch the videos. I enjoy playing it through. And then the Otherland server is now offline. So if you're in the chat right now and you didn't download Otherland and you didn't play Otherland during, you know, its lifetime, you can now never play that game. That's gone. You can't walk through the levels. You can't look at all of the inventory items. You can't look at the 3D models. You can't listen to the music. That game is gone forever. And that's a real shame. To me, that personally hurts. How are we going to be able to sustain the MMORPG server infrastructure to allow these games to be played in the future? What's an idea that you might have?
Yeah, well, this is where I may have to be a little more diplomatic with my answer here. Otherland, I recall that one. I remember seeing screenshots of it, and I think I wrote that down to check out later. I wasn't fast enough, it looks like. Yeah, okay, so the initiative itself, by the very fact that we're saying we're focusing on the outcome, which is, you know, a reasonably playable state, that's actually important for a few reasons. One of which is if we were just to say you must release the server binaries, or you must release the source code, or you must patch the game to include this, that, well, then that could very easily trip over existing copyright laws, where that say like, no, this is their intellectual property. We don't have the right to that. sort of thing. But since we're just taking the consumer protection route, saying, no, this should be workable, which is a standard in many, many other products or services, actually. I can get to that in a second. It does two things. One, it lets us sidestep all of that, so we don't have to worry about all these copyright complete walls that we would run into, that this wouldn't be feasible otherwise. And two, it leaves maximum flexibility to the developer. So some developers are going to say it'll be a cold day in hell before you can look at our source code. But yeah, we can maybe patch the client and accept like an incoming IP. And yeah, you won't be able to support 1,000 players, but we can maybe make it so you can support like 50 or something like that on an x86 machine. Others might say, you know what, we wrote this for just some custom shard hardware that in a server somewhere. This was never even meant for a consumer system, but you know what? Here are the server binaries for it. Good luck getting it working. I mean, yeah, I guess if you want to rent this custom hardware, you could run a private server and just point it there. See, whatever is easiest for them is what we're in favor of. That just gets us to the state of having playable in some form. And you brought up I think we accidentally dodged another one of your questions, but I forgot what it was. So.
No, this is fine. It's going to be it's a really interesting conversation. And I think the fact that you're focused on consumer advocating and consumer protection so much is interesting. Companies would need to spend small amounts of money on server hosting, on possible staffing, on ensuring the longevity of a game that they have made before. If companies are unwilling to spend any money, if they don't want ongoing costs associated with a game that they have made before, how are we going to preserve that game if the companies are unwilling to put any money or any time into it once the game is no longer profitable for them?
Yeah, that's another important point I should bring up. The European Citizens Initiative is not retroactive, even if we wanted it to be. So that means that this would only, if everything passed, this would only go into effect at a future date. Now, if games are still being sold by that time, it honestly would depend on the EU Commission what might happen, because some options are they would have to, if they just were to make no end-of-life plan, they'd have to shut it down before that date. Or maybe they would come up with an end-of-life plan retroactively. That might be possible for some of them. Or some might even get grandfathered in, where, you know, if that's the only way we can make it happen, sure. Now, but the important point here is the way people should frame all of this is, if it's a known requirement, you need an end-of-life plan at the very beginning of designing the game. So it's, you know, let's say you're designing a new MMO. If that's known to, if that's something they know they need to have in order to sell the game in the EU, then that's a hell of a lot easier than trying to re-engineer it after the fact when it was never designed for it, or there might be even licenses that create problems for them, including the server software, or they have to recode it. Whereas if it's known there, then they just write that in at the beginning. And so this would just this would not save every game under the sun, but this would kind of break the cycle in a big way. And that it might actually normalize this in developer culture, that this is like, I mean, this is a much smaller example, but how many games that are like MMOs too, that are published that have like just no achievements or anything like that? I mean, that's a relatively small thing, but that's kind of assumed that the game needs it for many, many developers now. And I think it would be that kind of similar dynamic. And again, it's a hell of a lot easier if it's at the start, and not necessarily, I'd have to get a developer in here to talk about the specifics for the cost, but the cost can be relatively minimal also if it's done at the start of design. And while we are only talking about the EU, actually, and the UK, that's what I meant to mention. The UK is a separate petition. Our odds are worse on that, but if we do pass 100,000 signatures for that, it'll be brought before Parliament, and you can pretty much disregard the answer that's been given so far. That has its own drama associated with it if we pass that threshold. But let's say this passed in the EU. if a developer is in like the United States or Australia or someplace, that does not mean they're required to have this in the game, but it does mean if they want to sell the game in the EU. So that's a market of 450 million people. So that's where the cost comes into play again. It's going to be way more profitable to plan ahead and have an end of life plan and be able to get in, additional potentially millions of sales within the EU than it would be to just say, okay, well, no, we're not going to sell in the EU and we're just going to miss out on all that money on the table. And this strategy kind of happened a little bit in Australia, where the ACCC, their consumer protection agency, sued Valve over not allowing refunds. Valve fought it in court. They lost, so that meant that they had to provide refunds to people in Australia. So then after that, they just kind of made it their global policy to allow refunds because they didn't want to rehash this battle in, district after district. And it was easier to just, the path of least resistance became to go with the consumer-friendly option.
We have a lot of people in the chat asking some really interesting questions about the specifics and the business side of it. I mean, for example, if I had to argue for the other side of this, I would say a company would be founded, they would make a video game, they would have an end-of-life plan. When they have stopped selling the game, the company simply declares bankruptcy and ceases existing as any kind of trading entity. There is then no one to go back to hold accountable for this end-of-life plan. Could the end-of-life plans for video games involve passing on any of the ability to continue playing them to the players, to the consumers? Could people host their own servers? Could people access a third-party server that is funded by a charity?
I mean, that's an option, but well, some of that's going to be mandatory just by having, unless they're exotic workarounds, just by having the game be in a playable state. Because, okay, we took the example of an MMO, and I may want to just something that's I glanced at in the chat in a second. Okay, I lost my train of thought. I hate when this happens. Okay, so the hand off the intellectual property, that sort of thing. By focus, if it's an MMO, that's advertised as being able to play with other people. That's part of the draw of the original advertisement. Well, if you make that completely offline, that doesn't really fulfill what was advertised. So that a game like that would have to have some sort of player-run server functionality. Like maybe it's simple enough that a player could host it on their own system and people could connect to it. Or if it's not, it could be the sort of thing where they release, server code for whatever the hardware was that did run that server for the MMO. And that's another way to get at it. Again, the more specific it gets, the more potential trouble you run into legally. And I glanced at a few comments in the chat where they're talking about that they didn't like how this wasn't specific enough. Here's the thing about the European Citizens Initiative. Whatever we write, that goes to let's say it passes, that goes to the EU, then they're going to hear voices from lots of different places. They might hear from preservation societies, that sort of thing. They're for sure going to hear from the industry. They'll be, which will probably fight this no matter what we write. And then they're going to come up with their own interpretation of this, as to what might solve the problem. They might run it by us for revision. They might not. They might just say this is what's going to be. So the simpler it is, the better, because it's going to mutate into something. We could write case scenarios that we suggest for every single scenario. Like, okay, an MMO with this kind of architecture, an arena shooter with this kind of architecture, etc. That could either all be completely ignored, or worse, they focus on just one of those relatively minor points and then think, okay, we'll fulfill this and we're just going to throw out everything else that you wrote and then consider it job done. So the more basic and fundamental, the better for a citizens initiative. We don't get to write the final law. We don't have that authority at all. The EU Commission would. So by just focusing on the game being in a playable state, that leaves a hell of a lot less to dodge, so simpler is better in that case.
Simpler is often better with that. There's a really interesting comment in the chat here. So a lot of people, a lot of developers specifically, a lot of game designers in the chat want to join us on this because it affects their lives, it will affect their future going forward. And an excellent message here is, can we not just accept that multiplayer-based games will one day be nothing more than a memory, but instead concentrate on stopping the requirements of single-player games requiring online connectivity? Now, I believe that that thought actually has crossover with the previous. It's about asking companies, hey, once this is no longer valuable to you, how can we preserve it as art? A lot of single-player games now require an online connection. Whether it's a DRM-specific thing, whether it's anti-cheat, whether it's data gathering, they like you to have an online connection for this game specifically. Once that game is no longer sold, once it's no longer making money, once it's no longer considered an active part of that company's repertoire, if you will, would you ask that single-player games remove that online requirement?
Well, that's what the initiative does, actually. That's another thing that, in some ways, gamers are almost worse at understanding this than laymen. There's not separate laws for multiplayer or single-player games, except maybe like content warnings or something like that. So we're not seeking to create new laws to distinguish the two. And like you said, for some games, it's all just a soup anyway. I mean, I mentioned The Crew as an example. That's a perfect example. The Crew has a full single-player campaign with cutscenes, a story, boss level, that sort of thing. You know, everything you expect from a single-player campaign. Throughout that, you can have multiplayer. You can have people on the server, well, or used to be able to, just kind of drop in and out, like in between missions, like you see them driving by. You can play with up to 7 other people at the same time. So you have a race of up to 8 people. That's all you'll ever see it. And the game was marketed as an MMO. You know, so it's just like, let's just throw everything into a blender and just, so we kind of have to save multiplayer if we want to save single player also. That's the reason we've they kind of left us no choice, like you said. But the initiative itself, just the game in a reasonably playable state without requiring a connection to the publisher or affiliated parties. So if you're talking about that anti-cheat or the DRM, those are affiliated parties. So the idea is, even if the game is completely multiplayer and just there's almost no value for it as single player, like an old game like that is Star Siege Tribes. It's an arena, well, large arena shooter, no bots. You can run around an empty level, I guess, if you want single player, but that's it. The whole game is designed for multiplayer. But you can still connect to people online if you want it, even though the company, I'm pretty sure the company that made it isn't around anymore.
Interesting comment in the chat. Someone says, we have to accept that multiplayer games are going to die. In 20 years' time, League of Legends might not be around. Call of Duty Warzone might not be around. And people are giving examples of modern games that are going to effectively reach the end of their life and no longer be supported. The original Command & Conquer, I can still play with friends via using some software. Whether I'm using LogMe and Hamachi to simulate a LAN connection, I can still use that software to experience that game with friends. I think a lot of people in the chat right now are saying that we have to accept that video games are just going to move on and they're going to die. What I think we're trying to get through in good faith is that if a company is going to make a game that's going to provide an experience, it would be nice to have an end-of-life plan where when they no longer want it or care about it or are making money from it, players are still able to go back and have the experience that they had many years ago. The video game is still able to be played. Now, many years ago, we also had a term for this. We had shareware and freeware. A lot of older games move into the freeware state, where companies just say, okay, you know what, we're not making money, no one sell it, here's the whole thing, you can just download it and play it. Why don't we just demand that all modern games eventually become freeware?
Because you run into a lot of problems with copyright law again. Then you're running into like the likes of Disney, the recording industry, the film industry, all coming out against this. Like you don't want to awaken the copyright dragon on, or I don't want to. Like that would make this about 1,000 times harder than what we're trying to do. That's why we're really trying to stay in the lane of consumer protection, even though personally, I'm in full agreement that, I'd love to see abandoned IP become public domain. But no, you gave a great example with Command and Conquer. You wouldn't even need the updated software. If you and your friend still had a DOS system from the 90s, you wouldn't need to change anything. You could still play multiplayer online over the internet between the two of you. And that's another point. We're not at the biggest thing people get tripped up on is we're not asking for endless support. We are totally in favor of the companies wanting to wash their hands of the game whenever they want so that they never have to do any support whatsoever again. So let's say, a game is working today, but then there's a Windows update next week that it doesn't work. Well, if the game shut it down and it was working without having to connect to them or other parties today, well, then that's on the community at that point to figure out a workaround or something else. So, because that's normally what for almost everything else, that's what end of support means. It means you're on your own if you run into trouble. It's more recent that it means that no one on earth can run this ever again. That's kind of weaponizing the term there.
There's an interesting phrase here. People keep asking in the chat, who pays for this? Because there's obviously an ongoing cost with this kind of stuff. I like to see it in a similar vein, and correct me if you see it differently. I like to see it similar to a library, as in just because a publisher is not printing a book anymore, I can go to the library, I can find that book, I can read that book, I can enjoy the art and the story of that book, and then I can take it back to the library and somebody else can enjoy that book. The art is not gone forever just because the company that originally made it, whether the author that wrote it or the publisher or the printer, even if all of those people go out of business, if those people stop existing, we can still enjoy that book going into the future because of a library system that keeps the book alive or a digital archiving system where the book goes to. Everyone seems obsessed with the idea of who pays for it, and it's a thing that politicians are going to ask you. Who pays for it? How do we archive so much data, or do we just allow the players to have access to it for a limited amount of time, or is it worked out by a charity? Where's the money coming from for this to survive?
Okay, are you referring to your concept of like a library after the fact, or just the initiative itself, like what we're asking for?
Let's start with the library idea, because hosting digital data does have an ongoing cost. So once this end-of-life support has been written in, where is the data being stored? Where's it being kept? Where's it being downloaded from? Who is maintaining it?
Well, well, see, again, your idea of like sort of a digital library thing, which some companies do voluntarily, I'm all in favor of, but I'm not trying to mandate that, because if once you get into the law of it, I see it as almost impossible. It's like I compared like reforming copy. Well, it would need a hell of a lot more force than what I'm doing to reform copyright. You'd probably be better off asking like a preservation museum, or like the Video Game History Foundation or something like that. They're much more than that. What we're talking about is what we're asking for is actually how literally, I want to say, every single game operated until around 2004, which is either the game, once the company was done supporting it, okay, it's done supporting it, but you can still run it, on your machine if it's in good shape and there aren't, software updates that screw things up. Or it was a subscription service where they told you exactly when it ended. So, like an EverQuest or something, well, original, you pay for 30 days, you get your 30 days, then you're cut off. Now that in itself does not save games, but then it's a much more honest proposition and works within consumer law. And the thing is, companies have already been down that road before, because there was an MMO, well, you're probably more familiar than anybody, like an MMO craze after World of Warcraft, where all these companies were trying to get in on that, and they all either except for a few, they all either died out or went free to play because they found there's a limited market for that sort of thing of people who will pay every month. Companies would love to have you pay every month, but the thing is the market just isn't there to have that on a large scale. So if they don't want to move to the subscription model, so the path of least resistance becomes having an end of life plan. Now you're talking about who pays for it. That's kind of like asking, okay, who pays for having a sound system in a new game that's being designed? It's like, well, it's whoever's funding the game being created in the first place. This is one checkbox requirement out of like 100 that's involved with making a new game. And again, if it's planned for from the beginning, it does not need to be overly expensive or anything like that. And then once the game's released, well, that's already been built into it, and then the customers are paying for the game so they can recoup their costs to make a profit. I mean, it's literally having a requirement as part of releasing that game to the market that the customer is left with something at the end of it, unless it is a subscription service. Yeah, that's worth clarifying. If it is a subscription service, so that they tell you upfront, like Final Fantasy 14 or something. This may not save those, because those are only argument. We'd still try to argue for it, but we would probably lose. The only argument would be for sake of preservation. From a legal consumer protection standpoint, those are considered services because you were told exactly when it ended. So this kind of meets every criteria for a normal service. The upside is, how many games is that now? Like maybe a dozen or 15 or something like that require a subscription every month in order to play it. It's very, very few. Whereas hundreds of games that have an online only requirement, you pay once or you pay for a microtransaction or something, and as a one-time purchase with no stated expiration date.
So a lot of my audience are very familiar with MMORPGs, and you mentioned that this may not save them. And it is true that MMORPGs require a complicated server infrastructure for players to create a character on, to have that character saved, to access the data whenever they need to facilitate the multiplayer cross kind of sections. What genre or style of video games would you use to explain this concept in the most simple way? I wouldn't use an MMORPG to explain anything simply. I think they're a remarkably complicated thing. If we were to use a single-player new game that you can simply spend 50, 60 quid on, get it for a console, get it for a PC, and then in many, many years' time, you can no longer play that game. How would you explain what you're trying to do to someone who doesn't play video games?
Oh, okay. For someone who doesn't play video games, I would explain this as video games are being released essentially with built-in kill switches, so that you're sold a copy of the game, but at an undisclosed period of time, they don't tell you how long, they're going to decide, okay, we're going to turn off support for it, and that just renders it completely inoperable. So it would be like if you... Okay, yeah, the best real-world example I can come up with this is like a printer. Let's say you bought a printer and it has to connect to the internet in order to run. It won't print anything. And all the parts are there. It's capable of printing things, but it doesn't have the software to do it. And then after a few years, you're not told when, the company stops supporting it, and then now your printer is completely unusable. That's the best analogy I can make for people who aren't familiar with video games. And I saw a good comment, but I missed it again. I need to make notes as I'm seeing this stuff.
No, that's an excellent way of putting it. I mean, I've bought no end of printers, especially when it says, like, you are low on cyan ink, so I buy some knockoff cyan ink from somewhere because I don't want to spend the money on the really expensive stuff. And then it detects and says, oh, this isn't real cyan ink. You can't use us anymore. And I am thinking, everything that the printer needs to do its job is there. It just has this kind of digital overlord that is looking at it and saying, you can't do your job because the customer, the consumer, the person person that has purchased you has not followed all of the required rules that we have written to actually use you specifically. Printing is a great example because we can all collectively agree that we absolutely hate printers. I found many years ago it was sometimes cheaper and easier to buy an entire new printer than try and make the one that I'd got work in any way. I would be spending weeks or days to make it work.
Yeah, I mean, this is very much it's almost like this exists between gaps in the law, but if it was a little bit to the left or the right, this would be a planned obsolescence issue also.
For anyone unfamiliar, what is planned obsolescence?
Oh, planned obsolescence is when a company releases a product that it's designed to fall apart or stop working at a certain date. There's also the term programmed obsolescence, where it can be really blunt. In fact, this has happened with printers, I believe, too, where they'll program into the BIOS, the software controlling the hardware, that this is going to start having bugs and this is going to fail completely after like 3 years, but they don't tell the customer that. They have, unfortunately, hundreds of ways of doing this sort of thing, but the EU especially has been trying to push back against this sort of thing when it can.
Now, there's a lot of people in the chat, and this does deserve to be addressed. They deserve to be respected and listened to. People are saying that the entire plan feels vague, it feels unsure, it feels that we're lacking the specifics, it feels that you're asking developers to take on extra costs, they're going to try and find a way to weasel out of any way they can. We know what developers are. Maybe this will be extra work for the actual software developers at the time. Maybe the big businesses won't notice it. What I tend to think, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, Ross, is this initiative is built out of a love of video games. It's built out of an idea of wanting to maintain, to preserve video game experiences, to preserve the art that goes into it. Now, right now, the specifics are still being figured out, but it's very much approaching the companies who make video games with the energy of, hey guys, in a couple of years' time, when you've forgotten about this and it's all gone and you're not making money from it anymore, can we still play it? Are we still going to be able to have the ability to access the data that we've purchased, to download it from somewhere, to play it? It's not about having all of the answers right now. It's about putting this development and design notion in front of the right people and saying, hey, we need to sit down and start having the conversation that will ultimately lead to the answers that we need. No one's got all the answers of exactly how every edge case is going to work out right now. This is just effectively the spear tip. This is the start of a process for giving video games a longer life. There's lots of people asking for very specific examples. Ross, how do you feel when people come to you saying, this won't work?
Oh, well, again, I had several thoughts on this. Again, the first place you should start is, again, this is not retroactive, even if we wanted to. So it's kind of like saying developers cannot design a game in the future to have an end-of-life plan. So if you're going to assume that's true, then I think that's silly, and you get a lot of people from the industry saying otherwise. So so we need to start from the notion that this is possible in the future, and then kind of work back from that. Because no, I can sympathize with that. Even no matter how much you like games, want this to happen, if it's not feasible, then it's not feasible. I never would have started this if I didn't see an opening for this. For the specifics, again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. I can actually get to a lot of specific cases, and for ones I needed more information, I could bring a developer in to even get the more details. The problem is that, again, we don't have that agency. So we can get into specifics all day, but we don't have that authority in the EU Commission or at the consumer protection agencies. That's out of our hands. And the other thing is the specifics for some of this almost doesn't matter if it's breaking the law. That's something that's still, in fact, I think we are going, in fact, I would almost bet money that in the case of the Crew specifically, that Ubisoft is going to be found violating something. Now, what I'm worried about is that what they're violating may not be enough the remedy may not be enough to save games. But here's the basic legal argument for this. There's a directive in the EU, Directive 93/13 EEC, that protects consumers against unfair terms in contracts. And almost every online video game has a term saying they can terminate this game at any time for any reason. Or I believe Blizzard even says any or no reason. So if the courts in the EU find that saying, no, this is a violation of that directive, this isn't fair to the consumer, then that nullifies that portion of it. But then how long does the game last? Well, the EU Commission says, or notes here, Directive 2019/770 governs the law on video games. And that is riddled with saying, refers to the duration of the contract or the period of time for the contract. Well, there is no period. It says it can end at any time. So this is a complete no man's land legally. So no matter how difficult this might be, if it's breaking the law, they're going to have to come up with a solution regardless. And for the cost and the lack of specifics, a simpler way to look at it, especially for non-gamers, is I compare this a lot to lobbying for seatbelts back in like the 50s or 60s, to require automakers to have seatbelts included in cars. That is an additional cost. It was, and even is now. And it probably would be more of a cost if your factory was never designed to add seatbelts to cars. That you have to retool things, get new parts, supply chain. That could be a significant cost. But if you were designing a new factory, well, that's just one part out of like 100 that you have to factor for. And the total cost of a seatbelt now is relatively small. Now, when they were doing that, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think they were demanding that the customer who wanted higher safety standards for cars needs to specify exactly which model of seatbelt we're going to be using and where are we going to source the clamping mechanism for each belt. And that's not their job. Their job is to say, like, hey, the way things are now is really bad and we need a fix for it. Our fix is that we should require seatbelts, and then the actual government can figure out the specifics of it. That's our role in this. We don't have the authority to get more specific. But if you do want more specifics, I did make a video on this. You can go to my channel, accursedfarms.com, look up video FAQ on it. I answered almost 40 questions on this, and it's time-stamped. And your question is probably in there.
People in the chat, I would very much recommend you go to Accursed Farms and watch all of the kind of videos and data and details that Ross has already put out on this, trying to cover as many specifics as possible. There are people in the chat who will pop up with what they believe to be a gotcha question, as in they ask something and we can't answer it. In the case of Ross doesn't know or we aren't sure on what's going to happen yet, that will get added to a large bank of questions, which then kind of is taken forward and is slowly dealt with. Here's a really good example of kind of anti-consumer practices within video games. Did you ever play the game Shadow of Mordor?
Yeah, a little bit.
So
yeah,
in that game, there was something called the Nemesis system, and chat, correct me if I'm wrong on this. The Nemesis system in Shadow of Mordor was occasionally you would be attacked by like an orc commander or an enemy, and you would dispatch them or kill them in a certain way, and then later in the game you would meet the same orc or the same commander, the same enemy, and they would have scars on them based on how you killed them, and they called it the Nemesis system, which was, I think, a pretty cool system because you would meet the same enemy again. It added a personal touch to it. The thing was, the Nemesis system is now copyright to, is it Warner Brothers that went for that? There was a company that owned that system, and it can now never appear.
Patented. There's a difference between patent and copyright. I mean, all games are copyrighted.
Patented, sorry. It is patented, which means no other game can use the Nemesis system. It is very much, and I'm glad that you brought up the seatbelt system because, and again, chat, correct me if I'm wrong on this, the 3 connection point seatbelt design, whoever had the patent for that specifically allowed it to be used by every other company because it was so effective, because it was so safe, because they believed that was the right thing to do for humanity.
Yeah, there's a lot of. I think Activision had one where they have mini games when a game was loading. I think that got patented too. This probably would not solve that sort of scenario. This whole thing is just trying to solve the worst of the worst, where the game is unplayable by anyone. You'll never run out of problems with the video game industry to attack on. This is just the one that just bothered me to.
So you're not strolling into this and saying that companies must give up patents they've created, they must allow this to happen, they must allow that to happen. It's a very almost low-level baseline of, hey, if you make a video game in 50 years' time, it would be nice to still be able to play it. I would be able to find the data somewhere, even if it's on a torrent site somewhere, and have access to be able to play that somehow. Is that the most baseline, simple elevator pitch for what you're trying to do?
I go even simpler, that if you bought a copy of a game and it didn't tell you when exactly it was going to end at the time you bought it, it should not be impossible for you to. The company should not deliberately make it impossible for you to play it in the future.
Okay, so I love that phrasing. Deliberately make it impossible.
50 years, a lot of people will conflate that with, like, what, you expect them to update this game from the 80s for Windows 10? Like, no, we don't. You know, the customer, they can end support whenever they want. We're trying to make it so that they don't need to have any maintenance, additional cost, or anything past the date they want to end support. But that should not be synonymous with it being impossible to run the game.
I like that. I like that a lot. The idea is not the company must maintain it, they must update it, they must provide patches for it, they must put staffing and manpower and money time into it. It's simply, if you, as a customer, have purchased the game and you were not told at the time of purchase that it would be unplayable from a specific date moving forward, it would be nice for it to still be playable whenever you need it to be playable.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't say like it would be nice. It's more like we're kind of asking for this as a statutory consumer right, that they can't deliberately destroy it, you know, effectively destroy it.
That is, I think, where the Stop Killing Games initiative uses the word killing. It's not about saying, hey, the company isn't looking after and loving this game and supporting it and adding DLC and microtransactions. It's not building it anymore. It would just be nice if the company that made the game didn't actively make it impossible to then play in the future.
Yeah, we're trying to ban that, prohibit that as much as the law will allow. You know, again, subscription games, that one we might not be able to win on that. That one's a really weak stance. But yeah, that was something else I wanted to bring up, which I may lose people on this, but people brought up like a game being free to play and having microtransactions. That's a good. Believe it or not, we probably would cover those too, because there's not much of a difference in the law. See, here's the thing. If a game was 100% free, it's like complete freeware, this law wouldn't affect anything because there's no commerce involved. So this would have no impact. But if it's a free-to-play game and it has microtransactions with no expiration date, so, you know, it's not for 30 days character boost or something like that, then this would fall underneath it, because the general concept is under the law, you're not directly entitled to the free game. It's free. You know, you didn't buy anything. But if you bought skin for a sword or something, or like, you know, a character slot, well, in order to access that, then you need a working copy of the game. So it's not that it's the free-to-play game itself that the customer is entitled to, but if there's no expiration date, then they might be entitled to that purchase. And honestly, from the way the law looks at it, identical to a game that doesn't have that, but relies on a server provided by the publisher, where, if you bought a game, but it has to connect to the publisher, well, you're not necessarily entitled to that server, but you're entitled to the working game, and that requires some form of making that work. I almost couldn't find a distinction in the law between buying a game with an online-only requirement versus buying a microtransaction for a game.
There are many people in the chat, and I think it's very important that we do recognize that people will push back against this. This is the internet where everyone is a video game lawyer and everyone knows exactly how it works and everyone's a game developer. Many people are saying that it won't work, it's not a good idea, there are too many caveats for it. I would like to think of a reality where if someone in the chat right now who is not on board with this plan at all, if you go out and you purchase a video game for your console of choice, in 20 or 30 years' time, it would be great for you to set the same console up because a bit of nostalgia kicked in. You put the disc in, you put the cartridge in, you put the little cart in, you access your downloaded data, and you can play the game that you purchased again. Even if it's not fully online, you can do that. It would be a real shame if you spent the money and the time purchasing something now, returned to it in 20 or 30 years' time, and were told, oh yeah, support for this ended ages ago, you can no longer play it. I think it's just going to feel nicer in the future for gamers of the future, knowing that when they purchase and play a video game, they can then play that same game when nostalgia hits.
Yeah, and no, look, it's fair to critique this because there's so many nuances to it, and people will jump to what they're, again, our number one problem is people being against it because of something we're not even asking for, which is endless support. So I'm very used to this. No, for all the caveats you're talking about, see, I have seen some concerns about like malicious compliance where they technically fulfill, like I think we were talking about with the Tony Hawk Pro Skater or Skate or whichever game did that. That's less of a thing in the EU. I mean, it can happen where companies are less likely to worm out of this on a technicality because, again, it's more of a spectrum where it's like how many people are getting upset, essentially, is going to be kind of the metric. And the more things you leave out, the more the company might risk having action against them about that. But another thing for the people saying that they can't, like, that this isn't practical, I remember a lot of pushback at the time about allowing refunds of digital copies of games, saying like, this is going to have piracy run rampant, this is going to kill the games industry. Those arguments were around back then too. So it's, you kind of have to think very future focused, like, again, trying to like break the cycle. I'll be the first to say there are some games, due to the way the contracts were set up and the budgeting, it wouldn't be possible for them to comply under this because they were going in the complete opposite direction of being able to make this happen, that it's just a complete nightmare if this comes in after the fact. So those games we may not be able to save, but again, for a new game, can you really argue that requiring an end-of-life plan just isn't possible for the industry? Which it's worth also mentioning that the video games industry is, I think it's worth more than the music and film industry combined.
It is.
So it does have resources for this sort of thing.
Oh, there's a huge amount of money behind it, without a doubt. Now, there are so many specifics and so many small fringe cases and so many legal precedents that people would need to cross-reference and discover that ultimately that's what this is. It's a process of discovery. It's a process of saying, look, video games are great. We would just like to be able to play them in the future, especially if when I buy it, it doesn't say you will no longer be able to access this on this date. It's the games as a service idea. You are no longer buying the ability to play the video game whenever you want. I mean, a PlayStation 1, I've got a PlayStation 1 console, I've got PlayStation 1 discs. I can put them in it and it will play it. That's great. I know that the discs I've got for that console are going to work on that console. I have paid for them many years ago. I can still play them now. That, I think, is an alien concept to many people. The idea that you can buy a video game and 10, 15 years later, it will still be playable. To me, as old as I am, it very much seems like you're trying to bring the old school way that video games used to work, you buy them, you have them, you play them when you want, to a more digital age of gaming. Is this just about making the digital age of gaming feel like the old analog age of gaming?
Actually, no. We're trying to be more accommodating than that, because the old school way would be you have a private server functionality day one in lots of games. We're not seeking we want this to pass, so we're trying to make it as easy as we can and still save games for the industry. So, because there are lots of business reasons that they wouldn't want or just sometimes practicality reasons that they wouldn't want private server functionality. One might be, okay, we really want to crack down on cheaters for our game, and we need that kind of local, the direct control to have that. I think the main reason is they want to be able to sell microtransactions. And if you can run it offline, if you can run a privately hosted copy that with some hacks, then that makes the microtransaction worthless. So we're not seeking to disrupt that. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of that business model, we're just trying to keep it as narrow as possible to make this as digestible for the industry as we can. So it's more like once you get to the very end of support, then it starts looking more like the old days where, okay, now you can have a private server, or if it's just a single player game, then you can run it offline indefinitely, that sort of thing. And I saw somebody bring up a comment that they thought the reasonably playable state was too vague. The thing is, I mentioned the other reasons that shouldn't be too specific, but we could make that more specific, and that would be to the detriment of developers, because we could say, okay, that 100% of all features advertised to the consumer must be functional at the time of shutdown. Well, that's going to be a much bigger burden, and that might be impossible without endless support. Like, say it's a game that has like a managed economy or an auction house or something that has all the players at one place. Well, that's not going to be practical. So we want to leave some wiggle room for them for the features that aren't necessarily the core game, but it might be hell on earth trying to come up with a workaround for it. And you mentioned games as a service. Well, here's the thing. Games as a service or live service games, the vast majority of them are trying to have it both ways, because they'll sell it to you as a one-time purchase, but then you don't get to keep it. But if it's a service, then they're not telling you how long it is. So we're getting the worst of both worlds on this. If they really want to make games as a service, they have to act like an actual service then, which the industry does not want to, because they're going to lose a lot of sales if they go that route.
Most other purchases of services, you are correct, do involve a clause of time span. They say you will have access to this service for X amount of days, years, months, whatever it may be. MMOs are a perfect example of you are paying for access to the game for 30 days, for 6 months, however much you purchased it for. Now, the two competing, I would say the most popular digital online marketplaces are Steam and Good Old Games, or GOG. Now, I've got a very good relationship with GOG. I've worked with them a lot before, and I like the fact that when I purchase the games from GOG, I get to download the data required to run that game effectively to my computer. Now, if I wanted to, I could then transfer that data manually to another computer that is not connected to the internet in any way at all, and it would still run that game because I've got the data required to make the game run. Steam does it slightly differently. You don't always get the data required to run the game. Sometimes you require extra validation on Steam. Sometimes you require to be connected to the Steam servers. I'm sure many people in the chat use Steam. Probably not as many use GOG. Does Steam have an end-of-life plan that you are aware of? If Steam were to shut down in a couple of weeks' time, would everyone's games suddenly become unplayable?
No, not everyone's. It's Steam is the kitchen sink. It's going to have the ones that, yes, as soon as that happens, it's unplayable. It's going to have ones where it's not really much of a difference between it and GOG, depending on the DRM used. Yeah, actually, GOG is a good example where one way of looking at this is you would have essentially GOG functionality at the end of life. So it may not have, see, GOG, they don't release, their games just don't have DRM. So you get that full backup from day one. We're not going as aggressively with that, again, to kind of make this easier for the industry. But we get there kind of essentially in the end destination. Yeah, with Steam, that actually brings up another interesting point where the EU Commission would be the final say as to who parses this. But I could see it going one of two ways where, say a game is released on Steam, but it does have those extra authentications. Let's say it's just for Steam itself. But the company's done with the game, they're not supporting it, but the people who bought it on Steam still have it on Steam. They would either have to remove the Steam function, the actual Steam DRM for games that use that at the time they ended support. So Steam might still be hosting it because they're still up and running, but the game that's being presented now doesn't require Steam once you download it. Or it could be kind of a last man standing approach where, okay, the company that released the game, they're done with it. They're no longer liable for anything. But Steam, let's say Steam wants to keep selling it unsupported or something like that, or they'll support Steam but nothing else within the game, and they tell you that. Well, then if Steam ever shut down, they would be responsible for kind of removing the Steam check from that, which, again, it's going to vary wildly between companies and what the EU wants. So I could see it going either way, I guess.
So in that hinge case, in that very fringe case, it would be if you purchase the game. It might not be fringe, no, because how popular Steam is and how, video games are now the most dominant form of media entertainment. If someone has purchased a video game and it is playable in a certain state, if the company in the future shut down, if DRM is added or removed, you would effectively be asking for the game to not become unplayable just because the company no longer exists.
Yeah, again, if it becomes unplayable because there was a driver problem or operating system, that's not on the publisher,
So to kind of assuage the thoughts and feelings of a lot of the developers and the people in chat who are worried that this would add a huge amount of work onto it, it is not retroactively changing games that currently exist. It is asking for consideration of this moving forwards, and it's not about constantly maintaining and updating video games forever, but just allowing them to remain in a playable state once you have purchased them, or not actively making them unplayable.
Correct. They could walk away anytime they wanted, as long as it's not impossible to run it.
That sounds brilliant. Now, Ross, thank you very much for spending an hour and a half chatting to me about the Stop Killing Games initiative. For anyone who is watching, how can they support and where can they find more information about this?
StopKillingGames.com has our two active avenues. The rest, we'll just have to find out what happens. Unfortunately, it's only for people in countries in the or citizens in the EU and for the UK petition. Those are the only ones still active. So if you're an American, unfortunately, you're on the sidelines, kind of like me in some ways. I'm not eligible to be I'm not eligible to sign it, even though I'm in Europe. I'm not a citizen of it. So we're kind of having to. The rest of the world is kind of counting on people in Europe at this point for games preservations and their shot at stopping this.
Video games bring everyone together all the way across the globe, and I think we can all agree it would be nice if video games remained playable for many, many years after their launch and after their eventual shutdown of the company, after they get forgotten by whoever made them. It would be nice if the art of them can still be experienced. I would encourage everyone watching this Twitch stream to go to the Accursed Farms channel and enjoy Freeman's Mind, enjoy the game dungeon, and enjoy all of the data that Ross has put out on this initiative. Even if you completely disagree with the idea of stop killing games, even if you're completely indifferent to it, I think the Game Dungeon series is an excellent archive of old, obscure video games being made to work on modern systems, and I enjoy watching Ross struggle through playing them. Because I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to play those old, difficult games. Ross is going to do that. Ross, do you have any hints or tips for the upcoming videos on your channel? Any kind of cheeky tidbits you can tell us? What's the next game on the Game Dungeon?
I actually don't know what the next Game Dungeon is going to be. A follow-up where I kind of revisit big things I may have missed in previous ones, and that can take, it's going to take odd directions for sure. One thing I meant to add real quick. Right now, the European Citizens Initiative, we need to pass that threshold of 1 million by the end of July. We're unfortunately a little under halfway. At the rate we're going, that's not going to pass. What we're doing right now is kind of reaching out to foreign or non-English streamers and YouTubers that we've had a few donors kind of offer to contribute exposure on it. But really, anyone big can kind of end this, because if someone with enough size says, hey, this is your chance. If you want to, when you buy a game, you get to keep it. If enough people, that's our number one problem, is just making people aware this exists. So you ask what people can do. Tell someone who might have an interest in this, like a big or medium gaming streamer or YouTuber or anything like that, that this exists. This is pretty much a kind of populist democracy thing in action, where if we get enough people, I think this will end this and it'll pass, precisely because this is a legal mess. So yeah,
I would very much like to assume and like to think the best in people in general, and I like to think that the notion of enjoying video games, no matter what game you happen to enjoy, that crosses cultural boundaries, it crosses political boundaries, it crosses ideological boundaries. You can disagree on anything you want to disagree on, but it would be nice if many years from now we can still play the video games that we are playing now, that we played as kids, that we're going to play as adults in the future. You can hold any ideological viewpoint that you want to, but we can collectively agree that video games are pretty cool. And it would be nice if, after a company has finished with a video game, the people that enjoy playing it can still play it. Ross, do you have anything else that you would like to mention before we bring this to a close?
Just to add on top of that, you mentioned me seeing video games as the most important thing. I actually don't. I actually love lots of creative works like art, music, movies, books. The thing is, with all those other things, if I really want to, I can preserve those. Like if I see one that I think is wonderful, I can keep it. Video games are the only medium I'm aware of where you just can't, depending on the game. That's why I just singled this out, because it's like the exception to this.
So we're trying to
bring thanks for having me.
No, it's beautiful. Bringing video games up to the same level of preservation and the same level of enjoyment as other forms of art, books, music, any kind of artistic expression, artistic endeavor. It's nice to maintain it, preserve it, and to be able to enjoy it in the similar, at least, to the state that we bought it in. Ross, thank you very much for taking the time to chat to me. I will stick this up on YouTube. I've personally signed the StopKillingGames.com initiative. I would encourage anyone who wants to get involved to go and do that, or to go and watch the rest of your videos on your channel to have a more well-rounded and thorough view of this. Ross, thank you very much for taking the time to chat. Really appreciate it, and I look forward to the next Game Dungeon.
Thanks for having me.
Take care. You have a good day.
You too.
What an absolutely lovely human. What like a genuinely really nice guy. What a beautiful man. I have been a fan of Ross for so long. So long. I have a huge amount of respect for that guy. Absolutely. I don't always agree with everything he says. I don't always agree with every video game review he does. I don't always agree with every mechanical critique he gives for a game. But what I do value is the fact that we can have those discussions, we can have that critique, we can talk about this, and the video games remain. It's very important for the video games to remain. I'm not going to move that black square on the webcam right now. You can just deal with trying to read that. That's absolutely fine. For now, guys, I'm going to go and return and finish Expedition 33 because I haven't spent this long playing a video game in months, and I'm really enjoying it, and I want to see how it finishes. You guys, go and enjoy your weekend. There will be another video on the MMO channel and the RPG channel at some point soon, and I will be at MCM London if you are going to be at MCM London. I will add updates to the Discord, to Instagram, and to Twitter. For now, go and enjoy your weekend. Thank you for joining me. Good night, and God bless.